Duke Richard tore the brass alarm cord from his wife's hands. The braided red line snapped against his glove before falling into the snow between them. For one suspended moment, no one in Wycliffe's courtyard moved. Hundreds of tenants had gathered beneath a gray winter sky. Frost whitened the stable roofs. Beyond the manor walls, 12 isolated villages disappeared into hills already heavy with snow. Above them hung the Hawthorne Bell. Duchess Anne had designed the warning network 9 years earlier after an avalanche buried 2 shepherds beyond the eastern ridge. Since then, the bells had warned of floodwater, fire, broken bridges, missing children, and riders crossing the northern boundary. Richard knew that history. He had once helped her test the first tower. Now he turned toward the laborers waiting beside the wooden frame. "Take it down." The men hesitated. Anne stared at her husband. "You cannot remove the northern bells in winter." Richard's expression remained hard. 6 supply wagons vanished while your watchmen controlled those roads. My watchman reported the disappearances, after the cargo was already gone. A murmur moved through the courtyard. The missing wagons had carried flour, lamp oil, blankets, salt, and medicine, for villages that could be cut off for weeks once the deeper snow arrived. Anne kept her voice level. "Then let me examine the route ledgers, question the drivers' families. Give me 3 days. You have examined enough." Lord Cedric Vane stood beside Richard in a dark green winter coat, watching Anne with carefully measured sympathy. Cedric had returned to Wycliffe only months earlier, with plans to reorganize the estate's northern trade. Anne had rejected his proposal to replace local carriers with his private transport company after discovering that his projected costs did not match the distances recorded on his own maps. Since then, every disagreement between Anne and Richard had somehow ended with Cedric standing nearby. Richard held out his hand. "Your keys." The steward beside Anne lowered his eyes. "Your Grace?" "Her keys, Mr. Bell." Anne removed the iron ring from her waist. 12 keys hung from it. Signal towers, supply stores, watch shelters, maintenance rooms. The smallest opened the cabinet, containing the private signal records known only to Anne and her senior watchman. She placed the ring in Richard's palm. He handed it directly to Cedric. This time the crowd did not merely murmur. Several men cursed beneath their breath. "From this hour," Richard announced, "Lord Cedric will control the northern routes and all estate communications." Anne's gaze sharpened. "And the watchman?" "Dismissed." Richard looked across the courtyard. "Any man who continues to obey the Duchess will lose his position and his cottage." Anne took one step toward him. "Those men have families. They have duties. They have protected these villages for 9 years. They helped you build a private authority inside my estate." There it was. Not the missing wagons. Not the stolen supplies. Anne understood at last what Richard believed he was punishing. Her independence. The usefulness of a system that answered to her judgment. Above them, the laborers began lowering the Hawthorne Bell. The ropes tightened. Wood groaned. When the bronze rim finally struck the frozen ground, a low, wounded note rolled across the courtyard. Several tenants bowed their heads. Anne did not look away from Richard. "You think removing the bells removes my authority. I think Wycliffe requires one authority." "No," her voice remained quiet. "It requires warnings people can trust." Something flickered across Richard's face. Anne continued. "Every tower carries 2 methods of warning. The bells carry sound across the hills. The older drainage stones carry vibration beneath the ground when storms swallow the sound." Cedric glanced toward her. Anne noticed. So did Richard, though he appeared more irritated than concerned. "Enough!" Anne looked toward the empty bell frame. "If floodwater rises, if fire reaches the northern woods, or if a village needs help after the roads close, they will have no ordinary way to warn us." "Your predictions have cost this estate enough," Cedric said. Anne ignored him. She looked directly at Richard. "If anyone dies because these villages cannot signal for help, you will not claim you were never warned." For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then he ordered 2 footmen forward. "Escort the Duchess inside." Anne walked between them without resistance. She left the severed red cord in the snow. By evening, Cedric's men had emptied her office. Route maps disappeared first, then maintenance records, then the books containing the public bell codes. Anne watched from an upstairs window as boxes were carried into the courtyard. A flame appeared beside the stable wall. Her stomach tightened. Cedric was burning the records. Behind her, the bedroom door opened. Mrs. Greaves entered and locked it quickly. "Your Grace." Anne turned. Her maid's face was pale. "What happened?" "A boy came through the kitchen entrance." "A shepherd's son from Blackmere." "Why?" He walked almost 4 miles through the snow. Mrs. Greaves lowered her voice. His hands are badly frozen. Mr. Bell has hidden him in the linen room. Anne reached for her cloak. What does he want? He keeps saying he heard something last night. What? Mrs. Greaves hesitated. A bell. Anne stopped. The nearest bell to Blackmere was removed this morning. I told him that. And? He says it was not coming from a tower. They slipped through the servants' stair and found the boy wrapped in blankets beside a small fire. He could not have been more than 11. Anne knelt in front of him. You are safe. Tell me exactly what you heard. The boy swallowed. A bell, Your Grace. Where? He pointed toward the north. Blackmere Lake. Anne frowned. There is no bell beside the lake. I know. Then where was it? The boy looked frightened even to repeat it. He slowly lifted one bandaged hand, then pointed downward. Under the ice. Anne said nothing. The boy continued. It rang more than once. How? He closed his eyes, remembering. 3 slow. Anne's expression changed. Then 2 fast. Her breath caught. And then 3 slow again. 3 slow. 2 fast. 3 slow. Anne knew that pattern. It did not appear in any public signal book Cedric had burned. Only 4 senior watchmen knew it. It meant royal transport approaching. But no royal convoy was expected anywhere near Wycliffe. And one of the men who knew that signal had disappeared with the 6th wagon. Anne rose. Outside the window, darkness had settled across the estate. Snow covered the empty frame where the hawthorn bell had hung that morning. Somewhere beyond the hills lay Blackmere Lake, frozen, silent, and beneath its ice, someone was ringing one of Anne's secret signals. Anne waited until the manor had gone quiet. Shortly after midnight, Mrs. Greaves unlocked the servants' stair, and Anne slipped outside carrying a hooded lantern, a coil of rope, and a small iron tool used for maintaining bell mechanisms. Snow had begun to fall again. By the time she reached Blackmere Lake, the tracks left by the shepherd boy were nearly buried. The lake stretched before her like a sheet of black glass beneath the snow. Anne stopped beside the abandoned boathouse. For several seconds, she heard nothing. Then the ice beneath her boots trembled. A muted metallic note rose from somewhere below. 3 slow, 2 fast. 3 slow. Anne lowered her lantern. The signal came again. Not through open air, through the ice. She moved carefully along the shoreline until she found a narrow patch where the snow had recently been disturbed. Someone had broken through the ice there and allowed it to freeze again. Anne scraped away the fresh snow. Beneath the cloudy surface lay a dark shape. At first she could make out only a wheel, then another. Her breath caught. A wagon had been sunk close to the shore. Its canvas cover was gone, and one side rested against the shallow lake bed. The wooden panels bore deep scratches where a painted crest or company mark had been scraped away. One of Wycliffe's missing wagons. Anne looked toward the boathouse. If Cedric's men had simply wanted to steal the supplies, there was no reason to hide an empty wagon beneath the lake. Unless the wagon itself was evidence. The metallic signal sounded again. This time Anne noticed something else. A thin rope disappeared through a narrow hole near the edge of the ice. She followed it toward the boathouse. The line did not descend into the lake. It ran beneath the floorboards. Anne entered the abandoned building. Rotting nets hung from the walls. Broken oars lay beneath a layer of dust. At the rear stood an old storage cabinet that had not been there when Anne last inspected the place several years earlier. She pushed it aside. A square wooden hatch appeared beneath it. The hinges were clean, recently oiled. Anne drew the iron maintenance tool from her belt and lifted the hatch. Stone steps descended into darkness. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of damp earth, lamp smoke, and horses. Anne hesitated only long enough to uncover her lantern. Then she descended. The staircase ended in one of Wycliffe's old drainage passages. The tunnels had been built decades earlier to carry floodwater away from Blackmere during spring thaw. Most had been abandoned after sections collapsed. This tunnel had not been abandoned. Fresh timber supported the ceiling. Wheel tracks cut through the mud. Lantern hooks had been fixed along the walls. Someone had quietly restored an underground route beneath Richard's estate. Anne covered most of her lantern flame and continued. The rope from the lake ran through small iron guides along the ceiling. Now she understood. The bell was not beneath the open lake at all. A small warning bell had been fixed inside the tunnel. Its vibration traveled through the stone and frozen shoreline, making it seem as though the sound came from beneath the ice. Whoever was ringing it knew Anne's private code. After several yards, Anne heard a cough. She stopped. Mr. Harrow? Silence. Then the rope moved. 3 slow, 2 fast. 3 slow. Anne hurried toward the sound. Behind an iron gate sat Samuel Harrow, the oldest captain in her warning network. His face was bruised. Dried blood marked one side of his gray beard, and his left leg had been roughly bandaged, but he was alive. "Your Grace." His voice nearly failed on the words. Anne gripped the bars. "I thought you disappeared with the 6th wagon." I followed it." "Why?" "One of the road markers had been changed." Anne went still. The route markers were simple wooden signs used during heavy snow when roads vanished beneath drifts. Only the watchmen and transport supervisors knew the complete marking system. "Who changed it?" Harrow looked directly at her. "Lord Cedric's men." Anne had suspected Cedric since the missing wagons first appeared in the accounts. Suspicion was different from hearing the name from a man locked beneath her husband's land. "Where are the drivers?" "2 are being held farther inside." "And the others?" Harrow lowered his eyes. "Thomas Reed is dead." Anne said nothing for several seconds. Thomas had driven Wycliffe's northern roads for 16 years. He had a wife and 3 daughters. Richard had publicly allowed people to believe Reed had stolen the wagon entrusted to him. Anne tightened her hands around the bars. "What happened?" They questioned him about the signal routes. He refused to tell them which watchman knew the private codes. Harrow looked toward the rope. "That is why I kept ringing. You knew someone might hear it? I knew you would understand it." Anne looked deeper into the tunnel. "What happened to the wagon under the ice?" "They emptied it first." "The supplies?" "Gone." "Where?" "Cedric's men loaded everything onto different carts and sent them north." "Then why sink the wagon?" "To make it appear the drivers had vanished with the cargo. If anyone later found the wreck, they could say the men tried to cross unsafe ice." It was simple, and far more believable than the accusation Richard had made against her. How many wagons were hidden this way? 3 near Blackmere. The others were taken toward the old quarry. Anne remembered Cedric's proposed transport route. It passed the quarry before crossing the northern ridge. She had rejected it because part of the road was unstable during winter. "What are they moving through these tunnels?" Harrow glanced toward the darkness behind him. "That is what frightened them." Anne lowered her voice. "What did you see?" The Wycliffe supplies were only part of it. He shifted painfully against the wall. After the food and medicine were removed, another wagon arrived at night. "From where?" "I could not see." "What did it carry?" "Sealed military powder barrels." Anne frowned. "Gunpowder?" "I think so." Crown markings were covered, but one crate split while they were unloading it. The men treated it as though one spark could kill everyone in the tunnel. That changed everything. Stealing flour and medicine was profitable. Secretly moving crown powder through Wycliffe was treasonous. "And Cedric controls it?" "I heard his men taking orders from him." Anne looked at the lock. "Where is the key?" "The guard carries it." "How many guards?" "Usually 2 here. More near the storage chamber." Footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the bend. Harrow stiffened. "They are coming." Anne extinguished her lantern. She stepped behind a projecting stone support, just as 2 men appeared. One wore Cedric's green livery. The other carried a pistol. "You rang again," the armed man said. Harrow leaned against the wall. Perhaps rats have learned the code. The guard struck the bars with the pistol. "Lord Cedric wants everyone moved before morning." "Why?" "Because the Duke dismissed the watchmen." The man in green laughed. "The northern cottages are emptying already. We can store the stolen provisions there until the road clears." Anne felt something cold settle inside her. Richard's punishment of the watchmen had not merely helped Cedric accidentally. Cedric was already using it. "And the Duchess?" the armed man asked. "Locked in the manor. Does she know anything?" "His Grace believes she arranged the thefts herself." Both men laughed. Anne closed her eyes briefly. Cedric had not simply exploited Richard's distrust. He had counted on it. The armed guard removed a key from his belt. "Get Harrow up." He unlocked the gate. Anne waited until he stepped inside. Then she moved. She drove the iron maintenance tool into the back of his wrist. The pistol dropped into the mud. Harrow seized the man's coat and dragged him against the bars. The second guard lunged toward Anne. She stepped aside and slammed the iron gate into his shoulder. He fell hard. Anne snatched the key ring from the first guard and kicked the pistol beyond his reach. "Inside." Neither man moved. Anne picked up the weapon. "I said inside." They obeyed. She locked them in Harrow's cell. Then she turned to him. "Can you walk?" "Not quickly. Quickly will have to be enough." She put his arm across her shoulders. As they moved toward the stairs, Harrow stopped. "There is something else." "What?" He reached beneath his torn coat and pulled out a leather dispatch case. One corner still carried a broken patch of red sealing wax. Anne recognized the impression immediately. The royal arms. I took it from Cedric's men before they caught me, Harrow said. Did you open it? I had no light. Voices echoed from deeper inside the tunnel. Someone had discovered the missing guards. Anne pulled Harrow toward the stairway. They reached the boathouse and collapsed behind its rear wall as lanterns appeared among the trees on the opposite shore. Riders, coming fast. Anne opened the dispatch case. The first page listed all 6 missing Wycliffe wagons. Beside each number was the quantity of flour, medicine, oil, or blankets removed from it. The next page recorded payments to a transport company, Cedric's company. Then Anne found a crown authorization permitting sealed powder shipments to pass through Wycliffe without ordinary inspection. Her eyes moved to the bottom of the page. She stopped. Harrow saw her expression. What is it? Anne did not answer. She knew the signature. She had watched the same hand sign estate accounts, marriage settlements, and orders for more than a decade. Duke Richard of Wycliffe, her husband, and the authorization had been signed 3 weeks before he publicly accused Anne of stealing the wagons. Across Blackmere Lake, the riders separated and began searching the shoreline. Harrow whispered, "Could Cedric have forged it?" Anne stared at Richard's signature. "I don't know." For the first time that night, something frightened her more than Cedric's conspiracy. The possibility that Richard had known about it. Anne folded the crown authorization and slipped it back into the dispatch case. Lanterns were moving along both sides of Blackmere Lake. Cedric's men were searching for them. Harrow leaned against the boathouse wall, barely able to stand. "We cannot reach the main road," Anne whispered. "There is another way." He pointed toward the hill above the lake. An old inspection passage. It connects the drainage works to the western chapel. Anne helped him through the snow until they found the narrow hatch hidden beneath a stone marker. They climbed inside moments before riders reached the boathouse. The passage was cramped and nearly dark. Halfway through, Harrow stopped to catch his breath. Anne opened the dispatch case again. The authorization still troubled her. Richard's signature looked genuine. Too genuine. Harrow watched her. Could he have known? Anne wanted to say no. Instead, she said, "Richard has signed papers Cedric placed before him before. That is not the same as approving this." No. But neither was it innocence. They continued toward the chapel. Near the final chamber, voices carried through a narrow ventilation opening above them. Anne recognized Cedric first, then Richard. "You told me the shipments contained mining powder," Richard said. "They did, officially." Anne froze. Cedric answered calmly. "You wanted the northern trade route opened without every crate being delayed by Crown inspectors. I gave you the authorization you requested. I authorized transport, not theft, not prisoners beneath my land. And yet your signature opened every gate." Silence followed. Anne closed her eyes. So Richard had signed the order. He had not known the full operation, but Cedric had not forged his access either. Richard spoke again. "Where is Anne?" Cedric hesitated. "She escaped confinement. My men believe she reached the lake." "If she has been harmed, you will do what?" Cedric's voice became colder. "Tell the Crown you signed secret transport papers without reading them? Admit that your wife questioned my accounts weeks ago, and you removed her authority instead of investigating?" Richard said nothing. Cedric continued. "You did not need me to prove Anne guilty. You only needed me to give you an explanation you preferred." Anne felt Harrow look toward her. That was the truth Richard would find hardest to escape. Cedric had deceived him, but Richard had chosen to be deceived. Footsteps moved overhead. "We must go," Harrow whispered. Anne pushed open the hidden panel behind the western chapel pew. Mrs. Greaves stood near the altar. Richard was with her. He turned at the sound. "Anne." His face changed when he saw Harrow's injuries. He stepped forward. Anne raised the pistol she had taken from the tunnel guard. "Stay there." Richard stopped. "What happened?" "Cedric imprisoned Harrow and the missing drivers beneath Blackmere." Richard looked at Harrow. "Is that true?" Harrow gave a bitter laugh. "Would your grace believe me now?" Richard had no answer. Anne placed the dispatch case on the altar. She removed the crown authorization and held it toward him. "Is this your signature?" Richard read the page. His face hardened. "Yes." Mrs. Greaves drew a quiet breath. Richard looked up. "Cedric told me the cargo was powder for northern mines. And you signed without examining the attached route?" His silence answered. Anne continued. "I warned you his transport accounts did not match his maps. I remember. You told me to stop interfering. I remember that too." For once, Richard did not defend himself. Anne put the document back into the case. "You did not plan this conspiracy." Richard looked at her. "But you made it possible." Before he could answer, voices sounded outside the chapel. Cedric was approaching. Anne handed the pistol to Harrow. "Mrs. Greaves, hide him in the vestry. Cedric must believe he died beneath the lake." Richard frowned. "You expect me to hide a witness in my own house?" Anne looked directly at him. "I expect you to listen before your pride ruins another decision." This time, Richard said nothing. Mrs. Greaves led Harrow away. Moments later, Cedric entered the chapel with 2 armed men. His boots were wet from the lake. Relief crossed his face when he saw Anne. "My dear cousin, thank God she is alive." Richard held up the dispatch case. "You lied about the cargo." Cedric's expression barely changed. "We should discuss this privately." "No," Anne said. Cedric glanced at her. Richard slowly opened the case. "You will explain it here." For the first time, Cedric looked uncertain. Then he reached inside his coat and produced several folded pages. "I had hoped it would not come to this." He placed them on the altar. Richard read the first sheet, then looked at Anne. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It looked like hers. The orders instructed Wycliffe's watchmen to redirect Crown shipments, conceal missing wagons, and report through Anne's private signal network. At the bottom of the final page was her name. Cedric watched Richard carefully. The Crown already has copies. Anne understood. This was not merely a theft operation anymore. Cedric had prepared someone to take the blame. Her. Outside, horses entered the courtyard. A soldier shouted from the gate. Royal troops had arrived. Cedric gave Anne a thin smile. "They are here to arrest the person who organized the entire operation." Richard looked from the forged orders to his wife. For one dangerous second, Anne saw the old suspicion return to his face. She stared at him. "Do not do it again." Richard's expression changed. Anne gathered the forged pages. "Examine the evidence before you decide whom to believe." Heavy boots were already approaching the chapel doors. This time, Richard would have only minutes to choose. The pounding at the chapel doors grew louder. "Open in the king's name." Cedric remained beside the altar, calm again now that the royal troops had arrived. Richard studied the orders bearing Anne's handwriting. "Are these yours?" Anne looked at him. "No." Cedric gave a quiet laugh. "They use her signal codes, her routes, even an account opened in her maiden name." Anne took the pages from Richard. The handwriting was convincing, but the instructions were not. One order directed a wagon from Blackmere toward the northern ridge, using a signal that Anne had retired 3 winters earlier, after a bridge collapsed. Another assigned a watchman to a tower that had been abandoned for months. Whoever had written the orders possessed copies of her records, but they did not understand how the network actually operated. "These were copied from my books," Anne said. "Not written by me." Cedric folded his arms. "A convenient distinction." Anne pointed to the route instruction. "Ask Mr. Bell when the East Ridge signal was withdrawn." Richard read the line. He remembered. Anne had argued with him for 2 weeks over the cost of rebuilding that bridge. A final blow struck the doors. The lock broke. Colonel Ashford entered with several royal soldiers. He carried a sealed warrant. Duchess Anne of Wycliffe. Anne faced him. "You are accused of diverting crown property, interfering with royal transport, and conspiring to conceal prohibited shipments." Cedric gestured toward the papers. "The evidence is there, Colonel." Ashford took the forged orders. Anne did not protest. Instead, she placed Richard's signed authorization beside them. "And that is genuine." Ashford looked at Richard. Richard's face tightened. "The signature is mine." Cedric turned sharply. Richard continued. "I signed the transport authorization after Lord Cedric told me the cargo was intended for northern mines." "You were deceived," Cedric said quickly. Richard looked at him. "Yes." Then he added, "because I did not examine what I signed." Anne had not expected the admission. Neither had Cedric. Ashford studied both men. Anne stepped closer. "There are witnesses beneath Blackmere." Cedric smiled. "There were smugglers beneath Blackmere. One of them is Samuel Harrow, captain of my northern watch." Cedric's smile disappeared. Anne continued. "He saw your men remove Wycliffe's supplies from the missing wagons." Ashford turned toward Cedric. "Where is Captain Harrow?" Cedric recovered quickly. "If he was in those tunnels, he likely died when they flooded." Anne heard movement behind the vestry door. She waited. Cedric did too. Then Harrow stepped into the chapel, supported by Mrs. Greaves. His bruised face was enough to silence the room. Ashford approached him. "Can you identify the men who held you?" Harrow looked directly at Cedric. "Yes." Cedric's hand moved toward his coat. 2 soldiers immediately raised their weapons. Harrow continued. "Lord Cedric ordered the wagons emptied. He ordered the drivers confined. His men moved crown powder through the drainage tunnels. Ashford turned to his soldiers. "Detain Lord Cedric." Cedric did not resist. Not yet. Instead, he looked at Richard. "You know what happens if the Crown investigates this properly?" Richard said nothing. "Your signature is on the authorization. Your roads carried the cargo. Your own wife warned you about my accounts." Cedric smiled faintly. "You can still say she deceived both of us." Anne watched Richard. This was the choice he had avoided from the beginning. Protect his title, or tell the truth. Richard looked toward Ashford. "My wife warned me before the first wagon disappeared." Cedric's expression changed. Richard continued. "I dismissed her concerns because I believed she was challenging my authority." The chapel remained silent. "I removed her watchmen. I gave Cedric control of the northern roads." He looked at Anne. "And I publicly accused her without evidence." For the first time, Anne saw no defense in his face. Only recognition. Ashford ordered Cedric searched. One soldier removed several keys from his coat. Among them was one of Anne's old maintenance keys. Harrow noticed it. "That does not belong to a tower." Anne took a closer look. Her stomach tightened. "It belonged to the Northern Reservoir Control House." "Colonel," Ashford turned. "If Cedric's men have been using the drainage tunnels, they may have access to the reservoir gates." Cedric said nothing. That frightened Anne more than denial. She moved toward the chapel window. Beyond the glass, dawn was beginning to lighten the snow. Blackmere village lay directly below the northern reservoir. Anne turned back. "How many bells are still standing?" Richard's face changed. He understood immediately. None near Blackmere. He had ordered them removed. Then, faintly, beneath their feet, came a vibration through the chapel stones. Once. Then again. Anne froze. It was not one of the ordinary warning signals. It was the emergency pattern used only when water had breached a gate. Harrow whispered, "The reservoir." Anne looked at Richard. "You wanted the bells gone." Another vibration rolled beneath the floor. "Now we need them." Anne moved before anyone else. "Colonel, send riders to Blackmere. Harrow, come with me." Richard reached for his coat. "I'm going too." Ashford blocked him. "You remain under investigation." Richard looked toward Anne. "The village has no bells because of me." Anne held his gaze for a moment. "Then help without trying to command." Ashford allowed him to ride under guard. By the time they reached the first watchman's cottage, the vibration beneath the ground had sounded twice more. The dismissed signal keeper, Mr. Lowe, was already outside. He was striking a metal pan with a fireplace poker. His wife was loading blankets into a cart while their children helped an elderly neighbor climb aboard. "You felt the emergency signal?" Anne asked. "Through the hearthstones. Can you reach Blackmere?" "Not before the lower road floods." Anne looked across the valley. The bell towers stood empty. Richard followed her gaze. For the first time, he seemed to understand what he had actually destroyed. Anne turned to Lowe. "Forget the towers. Use anything that carries sound." Within minutes, the valley began to answer. A hunting horn sounded from the eastern cottages. A blacksmith struck his anvil in the evacuation rhythm. Farther north, someone rang a church bell. Then another horn answered from beyond the ridge. The network Richard had dismantled was rebuilding itself without him. Richard stared across the snowy hills. "They still follow your signals." Anne mounted her horse. "They trust them." She did not need to say more. A rider approached from Blackmere. "The reservoir gate is open. Water has entered the lower road." "How much time?" Anne asked. "Perhaps half an hour before it reaches the first cottages." Anne turned toward the reservoir. "Evacuate everyone to the western ridge. No one returns for livestock or possessions." Richard started to give an order, then stopped himself. He looked at Anne instead. "What do you need me to do?" It was the first useful question he had asked her in days. "Ride with Lowe. Keep the northern road clear and make sure every house is checked." Richard nodded. No argument. No demand to take control. Anne and Harrow continued toward the reservoir with Ashford's soldiers. Behind them, improvised warnings rolled across Wycliffe. Pans, horns, hammers, church bells. One sound answering another. Richard had silenced Anne's network, but he had not destroyed the trust that made it work. By the time Anne reached the northern reservoir, water was already spilling through the eastern gate. The control wheel had been chained in place. Harrow examined the mechanism. Cedric's men jammed it deliberately. Anne looked toward the valley below. Blackmere's first cottages were already being evacuated. "We do not need to close it completely," she said. "Only slow the flow long enough to clear the village." Colonel Ashford ordered 2 soldiers to help Harrow with the wheel. The chain would not move. Anne followed the mechanism to a narrow maintenance channel beside the gate. There is a release lever inside. Ashford frowned. The water is rising. I designed the warning system around this reservoir. I know where the lever is. Before anyone could object, Anne tied a safety rope around her waist. Harrow secured the other end. She entered the passage. Freezing water reached her knees, then her waist. At the far wall, she found the release lever buried beneath debris. Anne cleared it with both hands and pulled. Nothing happened. Outside, Harrow shouted, "Again!" Anne braced one foot against the stone and pulled harder. The lever shifted. A heavy metallic crack echoed through the passage. The control wheel above began to turn. The eastern gate slowly lowered. Anne felt the current weaken. "Pull me out!" Harrow and the soldiers hauled on the rope. Anne emerged soaked and shaking. A rider arrived from Blackmere moments later. "The last families have reached the ridge." Anne closed her eyes. "No casualties?" "None." Behind her, the reservoir gate settled into place. Richard arrived with Mr. Lowe shortly afterward. Mud covered his boots. "We checked every cottage," he said. "Everyone is clear." Anne looked toward the valley. Smoke rose from hearths abandoned only minutes earlier. Improvised warning calls still echoed from hill to hill. Richard followed her gaze. "If those men had obeyed me, people would still be inside their homes." He lowered his eyes. Anne did not comfort him. Then Ashford approached carrying a document recovered from one of Cedric's captured men. It was a route map. A single road had been marked beyond Blackmere, the abandoned quarry. Harrow recognized it immediately. That is where the other wagons were taken. Anne studied the map. If Cedric still had men there, they would be destroying whatever evidence remained. She turned toward Ashford. "He will go to the quarry." Richard looked at her. "How can you be certain?" "Because every route he used begins there or ends there." Anne mounted her horse. "And now he knows the crown is coming." Smoke was already rising above the abandoned quarry when Anne, Ashford, and the soldiers reached the ridge. Below, 2 wagons stood beside the old storage tunnel. Men were dragging sealed powder barrels toward a fire. Cedric stood near the entrance. He had reached the quarry before them. Ashford raised his hand. "Surround the road." Anne looked across the slopes. "There are 3 exits." Ashford turned to her. "You know them?" "I inspected this quarry when we built the northern signal towers." She pointed east. "One road leads back toward Blackmere. Another crosses the ridge. The third follows the old cutting track." Ashford divided his men, but Anne knew the soldiers alone would not close the valley quickly enough. She took a hunting horn from one of the riders. 3 short calls carried across the snow. A moment later, another horn answered from the eastern ridge. Then came the strike of a distant hammer. The dismissed watchman had heard her. Cedric heard them too. His men began moving faster. "Burn everything!" he shouted. One man threw a torch toward the stacked records. Anne pointed. "The ledgers!" 2 soldiers rushed forward and stamped out the flames before they spread. Cedric mounted his horse. He turned toward the eastern road. A horn sounded there, blocked. He changed direction toward the ridge. A church bell answered, blocked again. For the first time, fear appeared on Cedric's face. He had spent days dismantling Anne's network. Now that same network was closing every road around him. Cedric turned toward the old cutting track. Then a deeper sound rolled across the quarry. One bell. Anne stopped. Across the valley, the hawthorn bell had been raised onto a temporary wooden frame. Mr. Lowe stood beneath it. He struck the signal for a closed road. Cedric stared toward the sound. There was nowhere left to go. Ashford rode forward. "Lord Cedric Vane, dismount." Cedric looked at Anne. "You think these people will always choose you?" Anne glanced toward the ridges. Watchmen, farmers, blacksmiths. Men Richard had dismissed only hours earlier. "They are not choosing me." She looked back at Cedric. "They are choosing the warning they trust." Cedric slowly dismounted. The soldiers seized him. Inside the quarry tunnel, they found the remaining stolen provisions, crown powder, transport ledgers, and 2 missing drivers still alive. Ashford opened one of the account books. Names, payments, routes, enough evidence to reconstruct the entire operation. Richard arrived as Cedric was being placed under guard. He looked toward the hawthorn bell sounding across the valley. That morning he had ordered it removed. Now it had helped trap the man he trusted over his wife. Richard said nothing. Anne did not need him to. The bell rang again. By afternoon, the great hall at Wycliffe was filled with tenants, watchmen, surviving drivers, and crown officers. Cedric stood under guard near the doors. Colonel Ashford placed the recovered quarry ledgers on the long table. One by one, the evidence was examined. The missing provisions had been sold through Cedric's transport company. The crown powder had been moved through Wycliffe under Richard's signed authorization. The forged orders bearing Anne's handwriting had been copied from records taken from her office after Richard stripped her of authority. Harrow identified the men who had held him beneath Blackmere. The two surviving drivers confirmed that Cedric ordered the wagons emptied before they were hidden. Cedric listened without speaking. Then Ashford turned to Richard. "Your Grace, did Duchess Anne warn you about irregularities in Lord Cedric's accounts?" Richard looked across the hall. Every person he had publicly ordered to distrust her was watching him. "Yes." "Before the wagons disappeared?" "Yes." "And you nevertheless transferred control of the northern routes to Lord Cedric?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I did." Cedric finally smiled. "You see, cousin? Your signature remains on every important document." Richard looked toward him. "Yes." The answer surprised Cedric. Richard stepped forward. "My wife did not deceive me." The hall grew silent. "I deceived myself." Anne watched him carefully. Richard continued. "She showed me discrepancies in Cedric's accounts. I treated her questions as an attack on my authority." He looked toward the dismissed watchmen. "When they supported her, I dismissed them. Then toward the tenants. When supplies disappeared, I accused her before examining the evidence. Finally, he faced Anne. Cedric succeeded because I gave him access, signatures, and trust he had not earned." Cedric's expression hardened. "You are condemning yourself." Richard did not look away. "Then I will answer for what I did." Ashford closed the ledger. Cedric would be taken to London with the recovered documents and witnesses. The Crown investigation into Richard's authorization would continue separately. Anne felt no triumph. Thomas Reed was still dead. Families had nearly drowned because their warning system had been dismantled. An apology could not undo either. Richard seemed to understand that. Before the inquiry ended, he ordered every dismissed watchman reinstated and their cottages restored. Then he did something Anne had not expected. He placed the signal towers, bell foundry, and maintenance funds under Anne's independent control until the Crown decided Wycliffe's future, not as a gift, as restitution. Richard did not ask whether she accepted. He simply signed the transfer and placed it before her. Outside, the hawthorn bells sounded across the valley. This time no one in the hall mistook what it meant. The roads were safe again. But Anne knew something else had ended that day. Richard might restore the bells. He could not restore the trust he had broken. By evening, Wycliffe had grown quiet again. The soldiers had taken Cedric away. The surviving drivers were with the physician. Across the northern valley, watchmen were repairing the warning posts Richard had ordered dismantled that morning. Anne stood beside the fallen section of the hawthorn frame when Richard approached. He stopped several feet away. For once, he did not reach for her. "I have placed money in trust for Thomas Reed's wife and daughters," he said. Anne looked at him. "That will help them. It will not replace him." "No," Richard lowered his gaze. "I know." The answer mattered more than an excuse would have. He continued. "The Crown may remove me from the administration of Wycliffe while they investigate my signatures." "They should." "Yes." Anne studied him. Hours earlier, he would have heard those words as humiliation. Now he accepted them. But acceptance did not erase what had happened. "You believed Cedric because believing him was easier," Anne said. Richard did not deny it. "You questioned my authority in public," he replied quietly. "I questioned bad accounts. I know that now." "You knew enough then." That silenced him. Anne looked toward the valley. "Every time I gave you evidence, you turned it into a contest between husband and wife, between your authority and mine." Richard's face tightened. "And people paid for that." "Yes." A bell sounded faintly from the eastern ridge as workers tested a repaired line. Richard listened. "I thought the network had become a symbol of how little Wycliffe needed me." Anne turned toward him. "And so you nearly destroyed Wycliffe to prove that it did." He closed his eyes briefly. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I will not ask you to forgive me." Anne said nothing. "I will not tell you that exposing Cedric changes what I did, and I will not use the towers, the cottages, or Reed's trust to purchase your return." That at least was different. Richard had spent years treating every concession as something that should end an argument. Now he seemed to understand that restitution was not reconciliation. Anne looked toward the manor. "I am leaving Wycliffe." Pain crossed his face, but he did not argue. "When?" "As soon as the northern roads are secure." "Where will you go?" "I have spent 9 years building a warning system for one estate." She looked toward the distant hills. "There are dozens of villages beyond Wycliffe, with no such protection." Richard understood. "You intend to build another network." "My own. Not Wycliffe's. Not Richard's. Hers." "The watchman?" he asked. Those who wish to come will be offered paid positions. Those who remain will keep the towers here. Richard nodded slowly. Then the transfer I signed today will stand whether you stay or not. It should. Another silence passed between them. Finally, Richard said, If one day I become someone whose words you can trust again, may I write to you? Anne looked at the man before her. He had finally learned to ask rather than assume. But learning late did not create an obligation. You may write. Hope entered his face. Anne finished. I make no promise to answer. Richard nodded. I understand. For the first time, Anne believed that he might. At dawn, the hawthorn bell stood again. The old frame had been replaced with stronger timber, and the red warning cord had been repaired rather than discarded. Tenants gathered quietly around the tower. So did the watchman Richard had dismissed the day before. Anne stood beneath the bell. Her traveling carriage waited near the manor steps. She would leave Wycliffe before noon. Richard remained at the edge of the crowd, not beside her, not above the tenants, among them. Mr. Lowe handed Anne the restored cord. The northern road has reopened. Anne wrapped her hand around it. For 9 years, she had used these bells to warn Wycliffe of danger. Yesterday, Richard had torn this same cord from her hands because he believed control mattered more than trust. Now he made no attempt to reclaim it. Anne pulled once. The hawthorn bell rang across the frozen valley. A few seconds passed. Then another bell answered from the eastern ridge. A third sounded farther north. Then another, and another. Across Wycliffe, the 12 towers responded one by one. The network was alive again. Anne looked toward the distant hills where she intended to build her next system. Villages beyond Richard's land would need bells. Watchmen. Roots. People willing to trust warnings before disaster proved them necessary. Richard approached only after the final bell had faded. I meant what I said last night, he told her. The towers and their income remain under your control, whether you return or not. Anne nodded. And Reed's family? The trust has been established. Good. There was nothing more that needed saying. Richard looked toward her waiting carriage. Goodbye, Anne. She studied him for a moment. Not the Duke who had finally admitted he was wrong. The man who would now have to live differently if that admission was ever to mean anything. Goodbye, Richard. She turned toward the carriage. Behind her, the hawthorn bell sounded again. This time, Richard did not touch the rope. Anne climbed inside, and the carriage began moving north. As it passed beyond the manor gates, another signal crossed the hills. One bell answered another. Then another. Anne listened until Wycliffe disappeared behind the snow-covered ridge. Richard had once believed the bells belonged to whoever commanded them. He had been wrong. They belonged to the people who trusted them. And now, for the first time, so did Anne's future.